Hey guys, today we're going to review one of the most iconic weapons in Israeli military history, and that is, of course, the Israeli Mauser. This is the rifle that is responsible for the birth of Israel and won the War of Independence, fought through the Sinai Campaign, the Six-Day War, and even into the Yom Kippur War, and will go down in history as one of those pivotal firearms to have really shaped history as we know it. So let's talk a little bit about the history of Israel and how these weapons came to play the part that they did. So Israel declared independence in 1948. Don't forget there was the British Mandate up to that point, and you had a pre-state government basically, which was the Jewish agency, and you had three different militias. You had the Haganah, the Irgun Tzva'i Leumi, and the Lehi. And these three rival militias with rival ideologies were all fighting the British as well as the Arabs for the independence of a Jewish state in what was then Palestine. Comes 1948, and there were very, very few weapons that the Jews there had. Whatever they had was either captured from the British, smuggled illegally in, or had been in some cases granted to them by the British for defense of their settlements. That's another complicated story, but there were very, very few arms. Now, the next day, after Ben-Gurion declares independence, multiple Arab armies invade Israel from Egypt, from Jordan, from Lebanon, from Syria, and they are being swarmed by these multiple forces. You have Fawzi al-Kawchi and his Arab Liberation Army. You've got the Egyptians coming in from the south, the Iraqis from the north, Lebanese, the Jordanian, the Arab Legion from Jordan, actually one of the only really effective fighting forces on the Arab side, but they were very well armed, and the Israelis were very outgunned and outmanned, and they were desperate for weapons, and the weapons that they had on hand were really makeshift and not nearly enough, and they were fighting for their lives. During this point, in the heat of Israel's War of Independence, 1948, the UN declared a weapons embargo on basically both sides, which only really benefited one side, which was the Arabs, because they already had all the weapons they needed. They didn't really need any more. It was the Jews that needed the weapons so desperately. And pretty much nobody was willing to sell them arms. The Americans at that time were not willing. The British certainly weren't. They just pulled out, and they were very bitter about the whole thing. There was only one country that was willing to sell the Israelis weapons, and that was Czechoslovakia. For various historical reasons, Czechoslovakia was very sympathetic to the Zionist cause. They had just suffered under horrible persecution from the Nazis as well, brutal occupation, conquest, and persecution by the Nazis, just like the Jews, and they felt bad for the Jews, as well as there was pressure from, believe it or not, Joseph Stalin, who wanted, for his own political reasons, for the Israelis to win independence. He thought that they were going to become a communist satellite country. It didn't work out that way, but that's what they thought. So the only country willing to sell them arms was Czechoslovakia, and they did, in fact, ship a huge number of rifles, machine guns, ammunition, pistols, etc. to Israel in that critical time, 1948 and into 1949. And the type of weaponry that they were sending was, in fact, Nazi weaponry. Believe it or not, this was all German guns and supplies. And the reason was because, don't forget, during the time of the occupation, the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia, the Germans, first of all, had left behind, when they retreated, a huge amount of weapons, but they also took over the Czech weapons factories, and they brought in their own tooling, and they were manufacturing their own weaponry, Mauser rifles, German pistols, submachine guns, heavy machine guns, on that tooling in the Czechoslovak factories. And so there was a lot of weaponry being churned out in Czechoslovakia. And so once Czechoslovakia gains independence again in 1945, they have this huge, massive inventory of German weaponry that they don't really know what to do with. So they were willing to sell that, and so that's in fact what they did. So there were tens of thousands of German 98K rifles in 8mm that were sold to Israel at that time, and that was really, really desperately needed, because rifles were the one thing they had the least of. Israel was actually domestically producing some really cheaply made copies of the Sten submachine gun, and they had secret ammunition factories for those pistol rounds for the Stens, 9mm, but they really, really needed rifles. And that shipment of Mauser rifles was pivotal in the defense of Israel. And so as a result, having that shipment of 98Ks, Israel was able to go on the defensive, and they eventually won the war against all those Arab armies, conquering a lot of territory and expanding the borders of Israel significantly. So let's talk about these rifles, because I have a couple examples here of the Israeli Mausers, and we're going to look at them and see what they are. So I got a great example right here. So this is a WWII. So this was actually manufactured in Czechoslovakia, 1945. You can see the marking right there, because the Germans, they used codes. They didn't actually have, let's say, Mauser factory or whatever it was on the receivers. They actually used codes so that the enemy, if they captured the weapons, there would be a little bit of confusion. So this is a WWII. And what we'll notice is a few interesting things. First of all, the swastikas have been peened out for obvious reasons. You know, when the Jews get these rifles, they don't want swastikas there. And there's a couple other things that you'll notice over here. You're going to see there are Israeli proof marks. That's a tzadeh over here, which refers to tzava. Tzava Haganah L'Israel, which is IDF. So there's multiple proof marks of that tzadeh. And then you have this little Star of David over here, which is another military IDF proof mark. So this is how you know that these weapons were used by the IDF, when you have those markings. So that's really fascinating. The weapon itself is pretty much in original condition, except for a few things. This is really interesting to note, that in the early 50s, the Israelis decided to convert pretty much every single one of their Mausers from 8mm into 7.62 NATO. And I might wonder, why on earth would they want to do a thing like that? I mean, it's a very cumbersome, expensive, difficult process to convert. You know, we're talking about tens of thousands of rifles that all have to be rebarreled. And the answer is very simple, because at that time, in the mid-50s, Israel was adopting as their primary battle rifle the FN FAL. Because this was already starting to get a little bit antiquated by that time. Don't forget, this is a World War II era weapon. They wanted to get with the times, so they made a contract with FN Belgium to manufacture the FAL. And what's the FN FAL chambered in? For those of you who are aware, it is, of course, 7.62 NATO. So they wanted to standardize. They didn't want to have half of the weapons in the military in 8mm and half in 7.62, so they decided to go ahead and rebarrel every single rifle in the entire inventory, save for a few that were just used for training and other purposes, into 7.62. So what you'll notice over here, there is, on this weapon, there's an engraving here. It says 7.62 right here on the receiver, right there, in a very clear way, so that nobody's going to make a mistake. And then also, that generally is engraved here. You'll notice here in the stock, in the bottom of the stock, they engraved it into the wood as well. So this is actually not the original stock. This is an Israeli-made stock. This is not the original Nazi stock. It's got the Tasiat Tzvait. This is an Israeli marking. The butt plate also, you can tell, there's a few things, indicators that this is an Israeli manufactured stock. But nevertheless, they would indicate that so that nobody would, God forbid, take 8mm Mauser and try to load that into the weapon. You know, catastrophic things have happened when incorrect ammunition's been loaded. So they literally rebarreled everything. So this barrel is not the original 8mm barrel. This is a later 7.62mm barrel, and then they just put them back into service. And this was used, again, all the way through the 1950s, 60s, and even into the early 70s. By the time of the Yom Kippur War, of course, it was no longer a frontline weapon. Even by the time of the Six-Day War in 1967, this was a second-line weapon. Primary combat forces had the FAL and the Uzi, and then later on AKs, etc. That's a whole other discussion. But that's the history of these rifles right here. I want to show you something else that's really interesting, because apparently something like less than 34,000 of the Nazi Mausers came in to Israel from Czechoslovakia in 1948 and 49, and that wasn't enough to equip the entire army. So what Israel ended up doing later on, they ended up buying a whole other shipment of post-war Mausers from FN in Belgium. They obviously had a good relationship. So you're going to notice there's two types of Israeli Mausers. There's the type that I just showed you, which was basically a Nazi gun that had been converted. And then here is a post-war version, which you'll see, made by FN in Belgium. And how will you know that this is an FN? Well, first of all, it's going to say over here, right on the side of the receiver, Fabrique Nationale d'Armes de Guerre Herstal Belgique. So the manufacturers of military war arms, Herstal Belgique. This is the stamp of FN. You also have some proof marks there, Belgian proof marks with the crown. But most interestingly, this is really the coolest part to me. You're going to notice right here on the receiver, what is that? That is the crest of the IDF. So that is incredibly cool, where you have the gun that's actually marked with the crest of the IDF. So this actually was used also in the IDF, this one too, except this was a post-war version. This is a pre-war version that has been converted. So these are both very, very cool, highly collectible. Another thing that I want to show you guys that's also really cool is the bayonets. So here is one of the bayonets that had come in along with this rifle. Again, this was an original rifle, one of that batch that had been shipped from Czechoslovakia. So they also shipped, as I mentioned, other weapons too, along with a lot of bayonets. So what this is an actual Nazi 98K bayonet, and it's got the marking over here. It says JOS Kurz. So that's Josef Kurz, I think. This is one of the manufacturers for the German military, and it's got a date over here, 39. So that's 1939, and we have a serial number over there. Those of you who are familiar with German bayonets, you'll be familiar with the bakelite grips. This is a typical 98K bayonet, except in one way, which is going to stick out to you. Look at the barrel ring over here. The original Nazi bayonets generally did not have a full barrel ring. And so this one actually has been clearly modified by the IDF. Once this got to Israel, the Israelis said, hey, we don't really trust that to hold onto the gun properly, so we want to modify this to include a full ring, which other Mauser rifles didn't have. And then also you're going to notice really, really cool over here. If we can zoom in a little bit, we'll see those same types of markings that we had on the rifle. You're going to have a Star of David right there, IDF proof mark, and then another Tzadeh within a circle. That's another Israeli proof mark right there. So that's how you know that this was used by the IDF. It's interesting. You have your Nazi proof marks up here as well. So this is a fascinating bayonet. You've got Nazi proof marks along with Israeli proof marks, just like this rifle. It's just as fascinating as the rifle, because you have, well, of course, your defaced Nazi proof marks for obvious reasons, along with your Israeli proof marks on this one, non-defaced Nazi proof marks next to the Israeli ones. Here's another really, really interesting example of an IDF bayonet. This one's even rarer. These were actually made in Israel by the IDF, and as legend would have it, they were made out of steel that was ripped up from train tracks. So apparently in those early years, 1948, 1949, it's actually got the year on this, 1949, Israel was desperately short on resources like steel, and so they ripped out train tracks, which they weren't really using, and they made them into bayonets. So this is a really, really fascinating bayonet. It's kind of a rough copy of the Nazi bayonet. You can see if you compare, it's similar, but it's not as nice, if you will. But I think that's kind of adds a lot to the beauty. It's got a really deep blood groove going all the way through. The top of it, the last few inches are double-edged. Really, really beautiful. It doesn't use bakelite grips, it uses like a much cheaper plastic. But what's really cool about it, if we can zoom in over here, it actually has a whole bunch of information in Hebrew right on the tang over here. It says Kidon Aleph Echad, which means bayonet A1, Hayotzer 101. So that means manufacture 101, which obviously is some sort of a manufacturing code. And then it says Shin 49, which means Shnat 49, the year 1949. And then it has an IDF Tzadeh, which is a military IDF Tzahal stamp right there. And then over here you have, again, there's that proof mark of the Star of David, which is typical of IDF marking. So this is a really awesome bayonet, and so this is the way they would have gone into combat. The soldiers would have been issued either one of those older Nazi bayonets, or they would have been given a newer Israeli bayonet. And so they were training at the time. Don't forget, this is the era of the bayonet, and so they were actually learning to fight with bayonets. So this is unbelievable Israeli history right here. The third thing I want to show you that I have here, which is really, really cool, is this is some original Israeli manufactured 7.62 millimeter ammunition. And this is the stuff that would be used in these rifles. This is for anything from an FN FAL, it would be for an FN mag, machine gun. This is the ammunition, so we're gonna actually shoot this original Israeli ammunition in this Israeli gun, giving that a shot. I just love the history here. Let's try it out. Hey guys, so we are loaded up with Israeli ammunition. I got it in these 5-round stripper clips. That's the way they would be used in the military. So let's go ahead and load them up. So I just want to show you guys, even if you don't have a clip, so you can actually load this, you can hand load this just like any other bolt action. You can take out your rounds from your clip and you can actually hand load them by hand. That's not unique to the Israeli Mauser. That's any Mauser system. So if you don't have a clip, don't fret. This is entirely doable by hand. It's just a slower system. Very nice weapon. I mean, I love it. It's super duper accurate. I mean, nails it on target every time. Very hard hitting. The 7.62 round is a proven, battle-tested NATO cartridge. The 8mm Mauser as well, also a very effective combat proven round. So, I mean, this is something that aside from being a historical piece, this is something that you could also hypothetically use to defend yourself and your family. Would I choose this as a number one, defensive rifle, home defense rifle, survival rifle? Probably not. But if you live in a place where there are heavy restrictions on semi-auto rifles, let's say you live in a place like New York City, or you live in Canada, Australia, Great Britain, where it is very difficult to access modern semi-auto weapons, you certainly could use this, just like the IDF did, to defend yourself, defend your family. It is a really effective weapon. Don't underestimate it. You are always welcome to come and train on this at Cherev Gidon, Israeli Tactical Training Academy. We have several of these in stock, and we'll be happy to run a course for you if you're interested in an actual Israeli Mauser course. We can do that for you. Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, or even in California, because it is so unrestricted. Anyway, guys, I hope you liked this video. Make sure to give me a like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.